Okay, without further ado, I'd like to now introduce our first keynote speaker, who will be talking about sustainability and the academic system. Dr. Astrid Eichhorn is Associate Professor at the University of Southern Denmark and a theoretical physicist whose research focuses on the fundamental building blocks of nature. She has a glittering academic career, has won awards for her research and teaching, and has been elected to the German Young Academy, the Junge Akademie, in 2018, and became quickly a member of the board of the Academy in 2020 and the Academy speaker in 2021. She also leads the working group on climate sustainability in the academic system at the European Federation of Academies, ALEA. And Astrid, myself, my colleagues and our audience are very much looking forward to hearing you today. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, James, for the invitation. It's indeed a pleasure to be here. So let me start my screen share. Which I think everybody should be able to see now. So I'll be talking about climate sustainability in the academic system. And what I will have to say is to a large extent based on the work by the ALEA working group on the same topic. So ALEA is the European Federation of Academies, and the working group on climate sustainability in the academic system has very recently published its report that you can find online at this DOI, or if you just go to the ALEA webpage. Many things that I will say are taken directly from the report. So in my talk, I will have 4 key messages for you. The first one is that the academic system is currently not climate sustainable. However, change is starting to happen and individual stakeholders are taking first steps towards climate sustainability. And beyond those first steps, there are actually many options of action that are available right now for all stakeholders to become more climate sustainable. And this transition, it's not necessarily just one that is filled with sort of problematic and negative challenges, but there are actually positive side effects and co-benefits in several of the actions for climate sustainability. And in the remainder of the talk, I will expand on these 4 key messages, and then I'm very much looking forward to discussing these points further with you. So the larger context of this talk is the climate crisis, where at 1.1 degrees of warming, I think the climate crisis is no longer an abstract threat, but for many of us is actually something that, for instance, through the increased frequency of extreme weather events, is actually something that is affecting many of us in our everyday lives. And in this broader context, academia is of course part of the solution through research, through education, and through evidence-based policy advice. However, there is a second aspect that has been much less in focus of the discussion, and that is that academia is also part of the problem through emissions from its own operations. And to make that point clearer, I would like to show some data and some examples. And in order to give us a framework in which to interpret that data, we will need some sort of guidelines or numbers in order to be able to interpret that data. And this framework comes from the 2022 IPCC report. So there you can find an estimate for a quote, remaining unquote budget of greenhouse gas emissions in order to limit, to have a high chance of limiting global warming to below 1.5 degrees. And that estimated budget is about 300 gigatons of CO2 equivalent emissions. And that number is a bit abstract. However, you can break it down to what it means per person per year until 2050, and then it's about 1 ton. Now, how should you think about that 1 ton? Is that sort of a very, very strict boundary? That's not the way to think about it. Rather, it gives you a rough guideline or a rough orientation. So if you have an action that leads to greenhouse gas emissions much above 1 ton per person per year, then that is something that is not very climate sustainable. And in contrast, if you have an action that leads to greenhouse gas emissions significantly below 1 ton per person per year, then that is something that is more climate sustainable. And so in that sense, we will now keep this 1 ton in mind as a sort of rough guideline when we look at some data from the academic system. Now, in the ALEA report, we have included all of those stakeholders that together make up the academic system and its framework conditions. And I will not be showing data on all of these. I would like to highlight 4 of the maybe most important stakeholders, namely universities, research institutes, funding organizations, and conference organizers. So let's get started right away with the universities. What you see here is a sample of 25 European universities. And you can see the greenhouse gas emissions per employee in tons of CO2 equivalent per year. And then you just see the number of universities that fall into each of these bins. Now, the first thing to note is that basically all of them are above this rough guideline of 1 ton per person per year. The second thing you probably see is that there is quite a spread in where these universities lie. Now, you might suspect that that has something to do with the profile of the university. So for instance, if a university is very international, then employees might use air travel a lot more. However, the key difference that makes this large spread is actually not the different profile, but the question of what is included in the climate reports. So those universities that are shown in lighter blue here, their climate reports typically only account for electricity and heating. So those include the so-called scope 1 and 2 emissions. But those are actually not all of the emissions that a university is producing. There are also the so-called scope 3 emissions. Those are indirect emissions. They come from, for instance, business travel. They come from building activities. They come from the supply chain, for instance, laboratory equipment or cafeteria food. And so these dark blue universities have more complete climate reports, and you see that they tend to cluster at this higher end of the axis here. And so probably these are giving us a more complete picture than those universities at the lower end in lighter blue, where the climate reports are incomplete. And so the conclusion to be drawn from here would be that we are currently quite significantly above this rough guideline of 1 ton per person per year. Now, let's move on to research institutes, where we can have a look very directly at greenhouse gas emissions that come directly from research activities. So what I'm showing here is an example from astronomy, and that is not in order to say that astronomy is a particularly climate harmful discipline. There are other disciplines which also lead to high greenhouse gas emissions. What is special about astronomy is that in astronomy, a lot of data is already available because a significant number of people have started to engage with the question of what is the climate impact of their research. So what this graph is showing you is the greenhouse gas emissions per year for a researcher in astronomy in Australia, about 42 tons, and then comparing to a research institute in Germany, about 18 tons. And both of these are clearly quite significantly above the 1 ton. Now you can see that a significant fraction of emissions is coming from flights in both cases, but also from electricity. And the interesting thing about that is that a majority of the emissions from electricity actually comes from scientific computing. So here we are looking at an example where a research activity is very directly causing greenhouse gas emissions. Now let's move on to funding organizations. Funding organizations do, of course, produce greenhouse gas emissions in their own operations, and that can also include the grant selection process. For instance, for the ERC, it has been estimated that because international panel members and international applicants are flown in, about 1 ton greenhouse gas emissions is emitted per interview that is being conducted. However, with funding organizations, we are also seeing a very significant data gap because, to the best of our knowledge, there isn't any funding organization that reports or even keeps track of the emissions from the funded research. And we've seen in the previous example with the research institutes that there can be research that causes a significant amount of greenhouse gas emissions. So this is very likely a very significant data gap. Now, the final example is conference organizers. I think we're all aware of the fact that flying to an international conference causes greenhouse gas emissions. And this has been evaluated for a large number of international conferences across many different disciplines. And on average, there's 1 ton per participant of greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, that is somewhat unevenly distributed. The fewer long-haul flights, of course, lead to more emissions than the many short-haul flights, but on average, it's about 1 ton. We all also know that the greenhouse gas emissions can be reduced significantly by going into a virtual format. They cannot be reduced to zero because running our laptops, connecting to a server and so on uses electricity that typically causes greenhouse gas emissions. Also, greenhouse gas emissions are caused in actually building the hardware that we're using. But nevertheless, there are estimates that the reduction compared to an in-person conference is anywhere between 94 to significantly above 99%, so a really high reduction. There may, however, also be a very good reason to hold a conference in an in-person format. And in that case, the choice of location matters a lot. So, for instance, having a conference where a majority of the participants comes from Europe, if you're holding that conference somewhere in North America, then that will lead to much higher greenhouse gas emissions than if you're optimizing the meeting location. So there are examples where optimizing the location leads to somewhere between 20 and 50% of savings. So to summarize what the key message of these examples was, it is that the academic system is currently not climate sustainable. So then what does it actually take to reach climate sustainability? Climate sustainability is not something that is part of our culture in academia at the moment. And so a cultural change is required, which means it's a change in individual behaviors, but also a change in the framework conditions and in the norms and incentives. And the second key message of my talk is that there are currently individual stakeholders who are taking those first steps to make that cultural change. And I would just like to highlight 3 best practice examples. One is a change that is in some sense very simple to implement because it's a change that doesn't require a change in behavior. And so a top-down strategy, for instance, by university management can be successful. And that's installing green energy on campus, for instance, using all of those university roofs for solar cells. A second example is a more tricky one because it requires a behavioral change. And so a simple top-down strategy may fail. And that has to do with travel policy. And here I would like to highlight a best practice example from the ETH Zurich, where university management has decided that there should be a travel policy and a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from air travel. But each department was then asked to come up with their own reduction goal and with their own strategy on how to achieve that. And so each department included their employees in actually coming up with a goal and with a strategy on how to get there. And this inclusive strategy of including all of the employees has led to a very high buy-in into the travel policy, at least according to surveys. And in the very first year after the policy came into effect, it has already led to a 10% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from air travel. And the third current example is something where we have made experiences during the pandemic, and we are using them carrying forward to become more climate sustainable. And of course, the experience that I'm talking about is that we have learned that a lot of physical mobility can equally well be substituted by virtual mobility. It's actually not necessary to travel for each single committee meeting or PhD defense or seminar talk. Of course, there are a lot of cases where physical mobility and in-person meetings are still useful, but not all of what we have done in person before the pandemic actually needs to happen in person. Now, what happens beyond these first individual steps? So my third key message is that there are many options of action which are available right now for all of the stakeholders in the academic system to become more climate sustainable. And you can read up on them in the recommendation section of the ALEA report. And our goal in providing these recommendations was to not just formulate overarching principles and general guidelines, but to be very specific and to name a list of actionable steps that can be implemented directly. Now, when you go through these recommendations, which I hope many of you will do, you will find that many of those might seem somewhat obvious to you. And that is because in order to become more climate sustainable, the academic system doesn't need to reinvent the wheel. There are a lot of things that we already know how to do. The only thing that we need to do is actually do them. So what I will do now is I will highlight 3 recommendations that are valid for all stakeholders in the academic system, and then I'll move on to the individual stakeholders. So for all stakeholders, we are recommending a mix and match approach to meetings. So different meetings have different goals, and so therefore different formats, in person, hybrid, or online, might work differently depending on the purpose of your meeting. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. For instance, it's not a solution to simply say all meetings from now on, whatever the goal, have to be online. There can be very good reasons to hold, for instance, a conference as an in-person or in a hybrid format. So we are recommending that meeting organizers sit down and reflect on what is the best suited format and whether or not an in-person meeting can be substituted in one of the other formats. There will, of course, be a significant amount of meetings that will be held online or hybrid. And here an important recommendation is to improve our virtual communication. By that, I mean 3 things. First of all, we need further improvements in technology, both hardware as well as software. But most importantly, we also need to work on our communication, on our virtual communication skills. And by that, I don't just mean finding the unmute button on Zoom, but what I have in mind is that, of course, we communicate differently when we see each other as small Zoom rectangles where we can't see all of our body language. That is different from meeting somebody in person. And so we have to adapt our communication skills in order to make this virtual communication more successful. And we still have a long way to go and lots to learn. And the last thing about improving virtual communication is that often it doesn't work to just take an in-person format and translate that to an online format. For instance, if you just take a coffee break from an in-person conference and you just hold an online coffee break, that typically doesn't work as well. However, online there are other things that can work, and so we need to experiment with those formats to find ways of organizing online meetings that make use of the new possibilities online and that work well. And the last recommendation for all stakeholders is to base your actions on a solid evidence base. If you don't have a solid evidence base, you might be putting a lot of effort into reducing a source of greenhouse gas emissions that is actually very small compared to some of the other sources. Having a solid evidence base is therefore important to formulate a good strategy that will lead to actual significant reductions. Publishing your evidence base is also important in order for you to be held accountable as to whether or not you're achieving those goals. However, it's absolutely critical to note that just publishing a climate report doesn't do anything to reduce your actual climate impact, so don't stop at publishing a climate report. So with that, I will now move on to recommendations for individual stakeholders. And here there's a longer list that you can find in our report. In our report, I will just highlight some of the examples, and I will actually not be going through the list of stakeholders here. Instead, what I will do is the following. I would like to ask everybody in the audience to put themselves in one of the boxes on my screen. So for instance, if you're leading a research group at a research institute, then look at the research institute box. If you're representing a funding organization, you can find yourself here. Or if you're involved in university management, then this up here is the appropriate box for you. And what I will do next is I will show some examples of recommendations, and I will stop speaking for 15 seconds to give everybody the chance to read what it says in their box. So here are the examples. I will now stop speaking for 15 seconds so that you can all read what is written in your respective boxes. All right, I hope you all had a chance to read the recommendations in your respective boxes. There is a longer list of recommendations for each stakeholders in our report. You might have noticed that there is a really important stakeholder that was missing here, and that's the individual academic. And this is because I would like to highlight an important recommendation here. The academic system is to a large degree self-determined. So there isn't so much outside influence in setting the framework conditions. In many of our roles as individual academics, we are actually part of shaping the framework conditions. For instance, when we're involved in university management, or when we're leading a research group, or when we're part of a committee, or when we're acting as referees. And so for individual academics, a key recommendation is to consider all your opportunities for leverage. You might have the possibility to not just change your individual behavior, but to actually contribute to changes in the larger framework conditions of the academic system. Now, implementing those and other recommendations will lead to a transition towards a more climate sustainable academic system. And one of the worries that people often have is that this transition is one of negative challenges and that it will somehow impact the academic system negatively. And that is not necessarily the case, because there are also examples of actions which have co-benefits. And that's the fourth message, that this transition isn't necessarily something to be looked at in a negative way. There are positive side effects or co-benefits in several of the actions that you can take to become more climate sustainable. And I would like to highlight a few examples. One of the most important ones is that online or hybrid meetings are by now well documented to increase inclusivity. First of all, that's global inclusivity. So for instance, researchers from, in particular, the Global South, where travel budgets might be low or non-existent and visas difficult to obtain, they can very often not participate in in-person meetings, but can more easily participate in online or hybrid meetings. And that might in particular be true for early career researchers from the Global South. And similarly, online and hybrid meetings increase the inclusivity for researchers with care responsibilities or with personal reasons, for instance, health reasons against traveling. So that is a very important co-benefit of making meetings more climate sustainable. A second example is that cutting the climate costs can lead to economic costs, but there are also examples where it can cut economic costs. For instance, if you take actions that reduce your electricity consumption, like running lab freezers at a higher temperature, that is by now being done in many laboratories, that cuts electricity costs, which actually cuts the climate costs and the economic costs. The third example is that substituting physical with virtual mobility can actually mean time gains. If we don't have to travel for a full day to attend a 2-hour committee meeting, there is more time we have, for instance, for research. And lastly, if you travel, then switching the mode of transport can also mean a gain in working or in usable time. So this is just an example. This is a trip from Vienna to Frankfurt, comparing air travel by train. And of course, the flight is shorter in overall duration. However, a lot of the time is actually lost time, for instance, due to security checks and so on. So you actually lose less time by taking the train. More of the time is actually usable time. So these were just some examples of co-benefits, which means that this transition to a climate sustainable academia isn't necessarily just one that is challenging and problematic. It also has some positive perspectives beyond climate sustainability. And so with that, I'll come to my conclusion, which is just reiterating my 4 key messages, namely that the academic system is currently not climate sustainable. However, change is currently starting, and individual stakeholders are taking those important first steps towards climate sustainability. And beyond those first steps, there is lots that can be done, and there are many actions that are available right now for all stakeholders across the academic system to become more climate sustainable. And lastly, making those changes is something that isn't just a negative challenge, but that can bring with it positive side effects and co-benefits. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion, and I'll stop my screen share for that.
Astrid, thank you. That was fascinating. It's great to hear the insights that you and Alea have come up on this very challenging topic that I think sometimes can seem almost an insurmountable force, but it's great to learn from you that there are things that everybody at all levels in the academic system can use. And also hear you highlight the additional benefits. This isn't just about what's doing right for the climate and what's for the planet. There are benefits of inclusivity and connectivity. I mean, in the chat during your in the opening part of this conference, I saw colleagues from India and Australia having a conversation. Now, in an in-person event hosted by a small UK charity, that would never have happened. And virtual means enable us at UK Rio to reach so many people compared to before. So there are benefits for organisations as well as individuals. That's fascinating. Thank you. We've had a lot of interesting questions, so I'll pick out a few from the chat. A question from Jane about waste in research. Is it possible to estimate how much greenhouse gas emissions we would save if we could reduce research waste? For example, research activities that are never published or not reproducible. Are you aware of any work on that?
I think that's a great question. I'm not aware of any work on that, but of course, this is one of the things where becoming more climate sustainable also ties in with other aspects of research integrity, reproducibility, as well as potentially open access, right? If you don't, for instance, publish your data, then other research groups have to reproduce the same thing. Whereas if you make your data openly available, then groups can collaborate, and the same thing doesn't have to be done over and over again. For instance, you don't have to run the same calculation on a big supercomputer several times. And so I'm not aware of any numbers. I'm not sure this has been estimated. I would assume it's very difficult to estimate. However, I think it's a great example where thinking of how we can save that type of waste ties in not just with climate sustainability, but also with these questions of research integrity, reproducibility, and open access.
Thank you. Jennifer asked the question about computing activities. Should the climate impacts of the academic system also include hosting, publishing, accessing of research outputs, or is it that this is already captured in some of the data categories that you mentioned? So publishers, library, data, and institutional repositories, that sort of thing.
So that is, to the best of my knowledge, not typically included. Scientific computing has been estimated, but the question of how much, what is the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that you actually need for data repositories and so on. I'm not sure whether this has been systematically taken into account in any discipline. I'm not aware of any work on that.
Fascinating. Perhaps there's some work for the publishers to do, looking at their impact on the system, and of course the repositories with the institutions. Thank you very much. Nicola said, thank you for a very interesting presentation, and noted that, as you said, it's difficult to replicate in an online format the ability to network with peers and with colleagues. So some aspects of in-person events are hard to duplicate. Do you feel that technology will improve sufficiently to enable this in the future?
So I would say there are already aspects of networking that to some extent are better. So my personal experience has been that after a lot of online conferences over the last 2 years, I've afterwards received emails by colleagues saying, could we actually just meet up for a quick Zoom chat and have a bit of a discussion? And those discussions are often more fruitful than the sort of rushed discussions that happen in a coffee break before one rushes back into the meeting room. So it is true that simply translating things like coffee breaks to an online format, that doesn't work as well. But there are other opportunities to build networks online, which I think is maybe just something we need to explore more or be more conscious of, or to some extent also change our culture and make it more normal to email our colleagues after a conference and say, can we please have a Zoom call to quickly discuss something? But I don't think that moving to an online format simply means that networking is more challenging. It's different.
Thank you. Richie asks, there's a culture of what we in England often refer to as presenteeism, and the fact that you feel that your colleagues and your senior and your bosses want to see you in person at things, which can and also want to see you in the office. So that can be do you feel that can be a challenge to people who want to take perhaps longer modes of travel to in-person events? They don't want to fly, they want to travel via land and sea, but that means they'll be absent from the office, from their desks and their labs for a greater period of time. Do you feel that can be a cultural challenge to try and shift?
Yeah, so that is definitely part of our culture that has to be addressed at the level of individual behavior. I mean, just normalizing the fact that it might take longer to travel to a conference, but also clearly take that up with university management and explain why there is actually a usefulness to doing that. But I think during the pandemic, one of the things that we have learned is that also a significant fraction of work works equally well when it's conducted online. And I think many institutions are also transitioning into modes where work from home for a few days a week, for instance, is much more normal than it was before. So I think there is a change that is currently happening, and that will probably be ongoing.
Yes, I think we've been doing that at Eukarya for some time. I think it was fairly easy for us to make the shift because we're a small organisation. I know it's challenging for bigger organisations, but I think following the pandemic, where changes in working practices were imposed by necessity, institutions have had the opportunity to look at what working practices are worth retaining in the long term. We're getting some great questions in the Q&A. Also some suggestions, for example, people saying, could meetings take place during longer meetings on ships or on trains as part of conferences? So should visits for conferences include longer stays to make the journey more worthwhile for broader collaboration? So it's great to see some ideas come up as well as questions. Kirsty asks, do you think it's likely that funding applications may ask for the emissions impact of a project proposal in the future? Do you think that funders might start taking this into account?
So I think there are a number of funding organizations that have started to think in this direction. And of course, then the key challenge becomes, how do you implement that without that becoming a big extra burden on the individual researcher? Because of course, for many of us, we don't necessarily have the expertise to really properly estimate what are the greenhouse gas emissions tied to our research. So the challenge here for funders becomes to provide good instruments to make those estimates efficient, to keep sort of the bureaucratic burden on the individual researcher low, and to also provide instruments that make those estimates comparable. If you just ask each individual researcher, please provide an estimate of the greenhouse gas emissions of your research, you will have wildly different numbers depending on what people have actually thought about including. So I think we will in the long run see research funders ask for climate impact estimates of projects, but the challenge here really is how to do that in such a way that it doesn't become a burden on researchers, but that instead it incentivizes researchers to think about ways, how can I do the same research with the same quality, but at a lower climate impact? So it's about setting the proper incentives, not about this becoming an additional burden on researchers. That I think is very crucial here.
Absolutely. I'm very glad to hear you say that. I think researchers and those staff who support researchers and are otherwise involved in research feel under a great deal of pressure because of the academic system already. And it's great to see this being presented as something which empowers and supports people rather than just adding additional pressure on top of them already. Amanda asks, she's a postgraduate student and wondered if you noticed in your slide that the student box was comparatively to others a smaller box, and wonders, is there more advice that you can give, given that students will one day become academics themselves? So how can students become more involved so they can sort of, when they start their full academic careers, already be thinking along the lines that you are suggesting?
Yeah, so I think students are actually playing a really important role in the academic system, not just as future academics, but because they are really some of the louder voices in this discussion, and they are also in positions to hold, for instance, university management accountable. For an employee at a university, it can be much more difficult to hold their management accountable and say, well, you're publishing this climate report, but are you actually reaching your goals? And students are in a much better position to do exactly that, to hold university management accountable, to ask for quicker change, to ask for things like, for instance, divestment from fossil fuels and so on. And so there are many examples across many universities where change of that form, for instance, divestment from fossil fuels, has actually happened because students have built up pressure and demanded that. So I would say this is really one of the most important roles that students have, is to pressure the rest of the academic system, and in particular also management levels, to make those changes that are necessary.
Thank you. That's really interesting. It's good to know that we can all play a part regardless of what stage we're at in our academic careers. Helen and Emily have both questions about offsetting of emissions. What are the views of Alea on carbon offsetting as part of the institution? Is it considered helpful or potentially bad practice to offset?
That is a very tricky question. I would say it has a lot to do with how you offset. I think it should be clear that offsetting should just be the last resort in a strategy where you actually reduce emissions, and then as a last resort, if you have emissions that you really cannot reduce, then you think about potential ways of offsetting. There are some examples of universities that, for instance, offset travel emissions in such a way that the cost of that goes into a university-wide pool, where the university then, for instance, buys equipment for virtual meetings from those offset costs. So those could potentially be better ways of offsetting than some others that exist. But of course, the challenge with offsetting is that it can create the psychological effect of saying, well, I've offset, so I don't actually need to think about reducing my climate impact in the first place. And therefore, offsetting should really be sort of the last resort. And if it's done, then think about meaningful ways of offsetting.
Thank you very much. Mandy asks, do you have any data gathered during the Alea work on the climate cost of disposable items used in research? We had a presentation at last year's ENMA conference, and Martin from the LEAF initiative, he talked a lot about how even in small amounts, disposable items, their environmental impact can become quite large quite quickly. She was wondering if you'd looked into this. Yeah,
so indeed, in laboratories, the use of plastic instead of glass is one of those topics that can have significant climate costs. I don't have any numbers off the top of my head, but a number of initiatives across various countries have looked at that and have also provided recommendations on how to reduce that. And the LEAF initiative, of course, is one of those examples where you can find a whole list of actions on how to cut down on those emission sources. More broadly speaking, it's true that at universities, actually, the supply chain seems to be really a very, very big factor in greenhouse gas emissions, and that, of course, includes supplies of laboratory equipment. It is also something that very, very few universities are currently including in their climate reports. So in a lot of cases, I think it's still a blind spot how much the supply chain is actually contributing to the greenhouse gas emissions, and in particular also the supply chain that provides laboratory equipment, including disposable items such as single-use plastics.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Monica asks, you're being asked a lot of requests for data on particular aspects of waste and climate damage in aspects of the research system. Monica asks, and it's a very good question, is there any data about the use of paper? Institutions seem to be moving more towards e-books and electronic access to journals. During COVID, many universities moved towards electronic theses submissions and away from the traditional paper copies. Now, that can seem to be greener, less physical items, less paper, less trees being cut down to make paper. But obviously there's the electronic, the impact of all the electronic devices and everything else. So is there any data on whether moving from printed to electronic materials is helpful? And is there anything else that can be done in this area?
So I'm not aware of data that makes this explicit comparison. I'm aware of data where, for instance, universities have calculated the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that is tied to their paper consumption. And that is a very, very negligible fraction compared to the other sources of emissions. A similar statement can be made if you look at greening conferences. Then, for instance, one of the things you could think about would be to not print your program. And again, that is an incredibly negligible fraction, so it's a really, really tiny fraction compared to just having a few less participants fly in. So I would say overall, this is one of the actions that is much more symbolic than actually impactful. And this is where it's very useful to actually have an evidence base, to just be aware of the fact that this is a change that doesn't make a big difference. That doesn't necessarily mean that at some point you shouldn't be thinking about that. But it's not something that will make a big difference. And indeed, I'm not aware whether anybody has compared to the increased or potentially increased greenhouse gas emissions if you just need more electronic devices because you no longer have a paper library.
Yes, no, that's a very good point also about, it may seem, oh, it's obvious we just stop printing our conference programs, but of course neglecting the fact that you're still having many people come through non-sustainable means do a conference in person. Interesting point from Gavin in the chat about sort of the cultural and equity and quality aspects of this, noting that at most institutions, the high profile academics will probably be the last people to lose their international travel costs, and it could be that those who are more junior will be under the most pressure to cut down their international travel and possibly lose out, or compared to their senior colleagues, at least bear the brunt of most changes. So this will need to be enacted with equality and inclusion very strongly in mind, and also with different countries, as Gavin noted in the chat, taking different approaches to this. Again, there could be people in certain institutions finding it easier to access international conferences in person, say, than others, and again, that could lead to inadvertent discrimination. Do you find that there's a push to make people attend in-person events still, or are people more open these days about the benefits of online and hybrid events? I should say, in the UK mainstream media at the moment, there are a lot of loud voices. They appear to be a minority, but a loud minority, saying, well, we should get everybody back to their offices as we did before the pandemic, where in reality most organizations and their staffs do seem to be embracing flexible working much more readily.
I would say currently it's a mix that is happening, which is probably very characteristic of when a certain cultural change is happening, that there will be loud voices on both sides. So within my research field, for instance, I'm seeing both a strong push to go back to in-person conferences, but also people who are now consciously stepping away from in-person conferences and organizing online events. And let me just comment also on the previous point, because I think that's a very important one, the question of who gets to travel and how does this impact early career researchers? Because there are data from a number of institutions that indeed show that if you look at career stages, then travel is very unequally distributed. And interestingly, in those studies that have looked at this question, it doesn't correlate with research impact. So for instance, if you try to measure that by something like an age index, there doesn't seem to be a correlation between the amount of travel and those indices. However, there is a correlation with salary, and indeed the more senior, higher salaried employees tend to fly significantly more. And of course, for early career researchers, it can be much more important to travel to build their networks. So indeed, keeping that in mind and asking the question, if somebody travels from a research group, who should that person actually be? I think that's a very important conversation to have.
Absolutely, a bit of more equity and participation in those kinds of things would be important. The we've had some interesting notes in the chat about this. Richie notes that for international students, sort of cultural exchange is often considered an important part of their studies, and also that the kudos of going to visiting academic institutions in another country, especially when institutions have, say, overseas campuses, for example, visiting the home, the main campus, is seen very important. You know, how do we make sure that people don't lose out on such cultural exchanges, but they're also done more efficiently? And Emily notes that, you know, students, if students are unable or unwilling to fly to go on field trips, for example, they could lose out in comparison with their peers. So that the kind of inculcation of early career researchers and students perhaps needs to change somewhat and change across the board. Pardon me. Astrid, that was a fascinating session. Thank you so much. We'll make sure we circulate the slides. I know the one that has the boxes where everyone can see where they fit in, and the fact there is something that we can all do at all levels of the system is, I think, it was very practically useful, but also very kind of positive and empowering message to send about this very big, very significant challenge, not just for the research community, but for every country and the entire human population. So thank you so much for coming along today. Thank you also for everyone who placed their questions. We haven't been able to answer them all, I'm afraid, because of time issues, but we'll look at how we can follow those up at a later date. So Astrid, thank you very much for joining us today, and I hope you enjoy listening into the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.
Thanks, James.